Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. For the month of May, we've been reading One Art, Robert Giroux's collection of the letters of the great American poet Elizabeth Bishop. These are arranged in chronological order rather than by artistic period or whatnot, and we have followed Elizabeth Bishop from her earliest days as a young girl and as a student, and then as an acolyte at the feet of established literary figures like Marianne Moore, the great poet, or Edmund Wilson, the great critic. We have followed her through her life, through her travels in these letters. A lot of you have pointed out in your correspondence with me that she is an incredibly vivid writer, even in the prose of letters. That's absolutely true. I've been very encouraged, pleased. It wasn't part of my fiendish plan, although I was hoping. But I've been very encouraged and pleased to learn how many of you are being prompted by these letters to find her verse, to go and find her poems and see what you make of them. This book very much had that effect on readers when it was first published. And I think it was probably intended to have that effect. I'm certainly glad that it did. One of the best sentiments that I've got in the mail, one of you wrote and said, I'm unfamiliar with her poetry, and this letter collection is making me want to go and experience it, go and investigate the poetry. And then this person added, if you're watching, I put a smile on my face. I already wrote and said it put a smile on my face the whole day. But this person added, judging by the letters, I think I will let the poems work on me for a while. That is a very good approach to take, because it's impossible to avoid the fact that these letters start off with a young girl who's incredibly smart and also an incredibly deep stream. Someone who's watching her own emotions and questioning everything. And that stays true for the whole course of the book, where we see this person questing and learning and fumbling and growing and having ambition, and then flourishing in professional and also personal happiness. Decade or more of intense personal and professional happiness. And you probably know what's coming, no matter what you do or don't know about letter collections, and no matter what you do or don't know about Elizabeth Bishop, you probably know what's coming. Most of us are not fated to maintain that period of blissful personal and professional happiness forever. Our endings are usually awkward, squalid, mean, disappointed. And that was certainly true with Elizabeth Bishop, who fetched up an apartment in Boston for the last decade of her life and was teaching, had classes, had very well-positioned professional friends, but was not a happy person at all. And it starts to shade the letters. More than shade them, it starts to be the DNA of which they are composed. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me. The final act of this book is always fascinating to me to read. A little bit on the sad side, of course, by the time you get to page 500 of this book, even if you're reading it as a fiction reader, you still want nothing but the best from this main character. You don't want this main character to be bitter or unhappy or heartbroken or thwarted. And you get all of that in the last chapter, the last act of this book, which also includes, as did the first act, a significant amount of letters to another great poet. Elizabeth Poet, when she was a younger person, wrote frequently to Marianne Moore. In these later letters, she writes frequently to James Merrill, another great American poet, including this letter from 1970 that would have been just mystifying to 20-year-old Elizabeth Bishop living in an apartment. She writes to James Merrill, your troubles in Athens sound only too familiar. Today I have had 3 hopelessly lazy workmen downstairs. I have to fire them, and I'm trying to get up my courage to do so. The new maid or cook, of whom I expected great things, is having a sulking and crying fit after working here 10 days, and no one can make out what the matter is. Then she broke a long, thin strip, several feet, of marble off the almost brand new kitchen sink, just wiping it, she says. To top it all off, she is being very rude. You're right to have a room at the top of the house to get away from it all in. I haven't, and although it is a big house for here, I have a very good study. Things just seem to seep through the walls. Oh, and now the Siamese cat is howling at the study door. No one feeds him but me, and he's also lonely since Tobias, my other darling cat, died a while ago, at the amazing age for a cat in the tropics of 18. We have some serious electrical problems too. In fact, I am redoing most of the wiring and piping. Yes, getting away in the desert must have been wonderful. I find myself dreaming of getting away to a small flat in New York, of all places, where I might have real privacy and no emotions brewing around but my own. And that, in the context of that letter, that might seem to have a lot to do with lazy workmen and a hysterical maid. But I think it's easy to see that it also has a lot to do with the past. I think it's easy to see that Elizabeth Bishop is pining not for a small flat in New York surrounded by street noise, but for the game young girl who would have handled that in stride and made art out of it. At this period, in 1970, this is an Elizabeth Bishop who is mostly abandoning things instead of finishing them, and who isn't completely sure of her own control of her own craft. She keeps writing letters all the way to the end of her life, literally the last day of her life. It was a compulsion with her. This book is big. It could easily have been 3 times as big. I kind of wish, as I've said before, that it were a little bit bigger, because I wish we had a few replies. I wish we had a little bit more context. Robert Giroux and his team did a great job annotating this thing. You're never at a loss, really. But anyway, we're going to go to Lewis Wharf here in Boston, to her apartment in Lewis Wharf in 1979, the year of her death. She's writing to a publisher here. I'm going to take issue with you rather violently about the idea of footnotes in her latest book. With 1 or 2 exceptions, I'll mention them later, I don't think there should be any footnotes. You say the book is for college students, and I think anyone who gets as far as college should be able to use a dictionary. If a poem catches a student's interest at all, he or she should damn well be able to look up an unfamiliar word in the dictionary. I know they don't, and most of them don't, but they should be made to somehow. And then later on in the letter, you can see what a nasty teacher I must be. But I do think students get lazier and lazier and expect to have everything done for them. When I suggest buying a small paperback, almost the whole class whines, where can I find it? My best example of this sort of thing is one that a rather bright Harvard honors student told me. She told her roommate or friend, who had obviously taken my verse writing course, that she was doing her paper with me, and her friend said, "Oh, don't work with her. It's awful. She wants you to look up words in the dictionary. It isn't creative at all." Can you imagine having the ability to take a poetry writing class with Elizabeth Bishop? In other words, it's better not to know what you're writing or reading. Perhaps my class at MIT has embittered me, but so did NYU and some of the Harvard classes, although there have been good students and a few wonderful ones from time to time. But they mostly seem to think that poetry, to read or to write, is a snap. One just has to feel, and not for very long either. Well, I could go on and on. Those comments like that might have some validity to them. You have heard the equivalent on this channel. But you can sense the tone in which that letter is written, and all of the letters in the last part of this book. It's very much the tone of someone who feels that all of the good and bright things have departed from their life and will not return. But they are still here. Also a large amount of alcohol involved, larger than ever before in her life. So unfortunately, our reading of One Art has to end on that kind of subdued note. It's still beautifully done. But it's the risk you run with autobiographies, which is almost what this is. It's very seldom a happy ending, unfortunately. So that is the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club for May, where we were reading about rather than reading. We were reading Elizabeth Bishop's letters rather than her great poems. Like I said, I've had a lot of correspondence from a lot of you. I'm leaving my email on every video. Feel free to email me about anything at any time. A lot of you are wonderful correspondents, and all of you are incredibly patient and forgiving when I'm on deadline or when I have some massive project, and both of those are true this week. You're very forgiving as to how fast I get back to your letter or how long I write in response. Very grateful for that. But a lot of you have written and said that this was a revelation, which is kind of why I picked it. Apart from the fact that I love it. I've loved this volume and reread it many times since it came out. But a lot of you have written and said that it was a revelation. A, that it makes you more inclined to pick up the next big letter collection that you see, whereas you'd never thought to read them before. And B, that it sends you to Elizabeth Bishop's poetry. That the next time you pick up, as one of you said, the next time you pick up an anthology at a yard sale or whatever, and you come across an Elizabeth Bishop poem, you will feel like you know the author really well. Well, you do. You know the author as well as you could know her, other than meeting her. That's what this book was for. So that's going to do it for the May STD infection. We will move on. We are going to move on next month with a slight change of plans. I had a book all planned for next month, but instead, we're going to do Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel, the second book in her Cromwell trilogy. We've already read Wolf Hall. Now we're going to read Bring Up the Bodies. If you have Wolf Hall on your shelf, you almost certainly have this on your shelf as well. A lot of you, in the years since these books started accumulating honors, have probably had them staring down at you from the shelf. Time to read them. They are every bit as good as advertised. You are only cheating yourself of a great reading experience to just let them sit there on the basis of widespread acclaim. So we'll get to that. But I'm going to do a second video. I'm going to do a separate video on Bring Up the Bodies. So that is it for One Art. That is it for Elizabeth Bishop. Several of you were asking me if you were going to do a Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club infection about Elizabeth Bishop. Why didn't you just take us through the poems? This is a deep poet, an extremely painstaking, slow craftsman of a poet. I didn't feel qualified to expound on the poetry. I would have done a very, very superficial job. Better by far to come at her this way and discover the poetry on your own. It's how she would have wanted you to do it anyway. Grapple with it on your own. So anyway, that is One Art. Very happy to have all of you join me. We're going to wrap this up for now, and then we will recommence with the first weekend in June. And I will see you all then. Thank you, BookTube.